reprise de débat. The honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to say that my colleague, the member for Burnaby South, has done remarkable work in listening to his constituents and also in understanding the issues around this whole thing.
Madam Speaker, August 20th, 2015 is the genesis of the motion that we are seeing today. And like my colleague from Burnaby South, I support the fact that it was brought forward. We're going to oppose this motion for the reasons that my colleague from Burnaby South spelled out. But on August 20th, 2015, the Prime Minister came to British Columbia, in front of a crowd in British Columbia, in Esquimalt, said very clearly that Kinder Morgan wouldn't be approved unless the entire process was redone. That was a solemn commitment that he made to British Columbia in August of 2015, just a few weeks prior to the election date, Madam Speaker. And that is the genesis of the problem that we have before us today. The federal government that has taken Mr. Harper's incredible gutting of environmental regulations and the NEB process, and the Liberals and the Prime Minister making that process discredited, a process that doesn't involve Canadians, doesn't involve British Columbians, making that process his own. In other words, the Prime Minister promised to redo the whole process, put in place something that would actually mean legitimate consultation with British Columbians, and he did the exact opposite. And that is absolutely shameful, Madam Speaker. Now, the Liberals have compounded this, as my colleague from Burnaby South has just mentioned, by threatening military action in British Columbia. We have an illegitimate process, a process that Liberals promised to change. They did not change it. Instead, they approved the pipeline when the Prime Minister said very clearly they would not. And then, on top of that, they threatened British Columbians. Now, that is why that badly broken, gutted promise that was made solemnly to British Columbians just a few weeks prior to the election date, that so many British Columbians have come out in opposition to the Kinder Morgan pipeline. We have First Nations that have come out in opposition. The city that I represent, the city of Burnaby, that also is represented by my colleague from Burnaby South, has come out strongly opposed, as have municipalities throughout the coastal region. Why have they come out in opposition? Well, it's not just for the reason that the process is illegitimate, that you have Mr. Harper's government, the Conservative government, they've gutted the whole process, made it illegitimate in anybody's eyes, and then the Liberals promising to do one thing and then doing exactly the opposite. It's also because of the impacts on the coast that could be catastrophic. Madam Speaker, I grew up in New Westminster. I'm proud of being somebody who grew up in the Lower Mainland. 4 generations of my family have lived in that area. My grandfather came from Norway, fished on the coast for a number of years. So when we talk about the fishing industry, we talk about the tourism industry, that has a profound impact on our economy in British Columbia. That we're talking about impacts that the Liberals have never investigated, never looked at, with an illegitimate process, and then the potential for losses of billions of dollars if there is just one spill. That is why so many communities have come out in opposition to this project, and that's why so many communities have said that ultimately, without a legitimate process, that this is simply something that has no credibility. I'd like to mention just one point, Madam Speaker. In the Burnett River area, my colleague from Burnaby South talked about the impacts on the Fraser River. The Burnett River area, where I walk my dogs every morning, is an area that could be profoundly impacted by the change in route, the new route that is being pushed through. There were no consultations. The City of New Westminster was not able to come forward with their concerns. This is a habitat that has been restored after decades of work by people who are involved in the Sapperton Fish and Game Club and other community organizations. They've restored the habitat, and now we have Kinder Morgan with the approval of the Liberal government saying, no, we're going to put a risk on the Burnett River as well. Now, Madam Speaker, these are profound risks. that have not been investigated by a legitimate process. And, Madam Speaker, I should mention that having been one of the few people in this House of Commons that has actually been ankle deep in oil, having worked in the Shelburne oil refinery, in the Burnaby tank farm, I know how the environmental impacts, how serious they can be. Having worked in the industry, having been ankle deep in oil, knowing how difficult it is to clean up even a small spill, I can say with some assurance that the incredible irresponsibility with which the Liberals have approached this whole process, not just betraying British Columbians by breaking their promise, but also by refusing to put in place any sort of public consultation process. The way the Liberals have done this is something I think that has alienated so many British Columbians. Now, Madam Speaker, my colleague referenced the Royal Society report. The Royal Society report is something that every single Liberal MP, not just from British Columbia, all Liberal MPs should be reading, because the Royal Society report speaks repeatedly to the fact that we don't know about the impacts on the Salish Sea or the BC coast of a spill of bitumen. We have no idea. That they request, the Royal Society, repeatedly for high priority, urgent research that needs to be done in all these areas because we simply do not know. So the Prime Minister's pipeline that he wants to push through is something that has profound impacts on the coast. And scientific evidence shows that the Liberal government and the Prime Minister have simply not done their homework. Madam Speaker, I was in this House when the Harper government gutted environmental rules in this country. I was here in the House and actually spoke to the budget. I spoke for 14 hours on it. There was so much to glean out because of the impacts on fish habitat, the impacts on environmental legislation right across the country. It never would have occurred to me, Madam Speaker, and it never would have occurred to most British Columbians, that the Liberals, having promised to address concerns that were raised by Canadians from coast to coast to coast about the gutting of those environmental regulations, the Liberals, once they promised that they would actually address them, would refuse to do that. But this is no small issue, Madam Speaker, because when we talk about the impacts of just one spill, we are talking about impacts that could last for a generation. David Schindler, who is the foremost authority on water policy and water in Canada, recently wrote about the impacts of the Exxon Valdez. One generation later, those impacts are still being felt. The fishery has not come back in Alaska. The coast continues to be polluted by that spill. And, Madam Speaker, David Schindler is somebody who has profound scientific renown. And yet, Liberals, like they throw aside the scientific evidence from the Royal Society, throw aside the scientific evidence from David Schindler. So we know the Exxon Valdez had a profound impact and continues to have a profound impact. The Kalamazoo spill continues to have a profound impact on habitat after the expending of $1 billion. And yet we have a Prime Minister who came to Nanaimo a couple weeks ago in British Columbia and said that there would be no coastal protection unless British Columbians promptly ignored all that evidence and promptly agreed with the Liberals on building the pipeline. That is unacceptable, Madam Speaker. So that is why there is so much of a reaction from British Columbia. The illegitimate process, the broken promises of the Liberals, and then the threats, Madam Speaker, that unless the pipeline is agreed to, that there will be no coastal protection, there will be no environmental policies to combat climate change. Madam Speaker, this is a childish rhetoric that comes from this government. It's a childish rhetoric that is improper for a national government. We need a national government that will actually show leadership on climate change and that will put in place the kind of policies and process that actually consults British Columbians and consults Canadians. And that's something that Jagmeet Singh will bring to Ottawa when he's elected in 2019. Thank you, Madam Speaker.